Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Amateur Radio General Class, session number 9. During our previous session, we looked at the topics of oscillators, LC oscillators. We discussed what were the different types of amplifiers or different classes, A, B, C, A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, C, and D. We also discussed RF amplifier efficiency. Then we discussed the concepts of self-oscillation and how to address it by a process called neutralizing. Then we went on to discuss filters, different types, low pass, and also we discussed cutoff frequency. We then went on to discuss the band pass filters and then introduced the concepts of ultimate rejection and insertion loss. We also discussed balanced modulators and product detectors. We talked about what is receiver sensitivity. Then we went on to concepts related to DDS or direct digital synthesis and DSPs, digital signal processing. And then we ended by talking about SDR or software defined radio and relatedly the I and Q signals. So we would have also covered the question pool questions that matched all of the theory that we had discussed. So our agenda for this evening, in terms of the technical topics, we will discuss modulation. Specifically, we'll talk about AM or amplitude modulation. We'll discuss what is the modulation envelope, then also SSB or single sideband. We'll talk about an issue that can happen called overmodulation. Then we talk about other modulation types such as FM, frequency modulation, as well as phase modulation or PM. Then we go on to some very specific frequency shift keying or FSK, and then we'll talk about RTTY. Also phase shift keying or PSK, and then we'll go specifically at QPSK31 as one form. Then we'll discuss what FT8 mode is and the related software, WSJTX. Then we'll go on to some discussion on digital signals, measurements, and one link margin concept and the other concept, link budget. Then, of course, we will end with our usual question pool review. So just a reminder for anyone who is now joining the course or now picking it up on YouTube, this is the second level in the amateur radio exams called the general class. There's a previous level or level 1 called the technician class. And on your screen are the links to the courses. It's on demand, as well as all the material, including slides for that level of the technician class. So the links are on your screen should you need it. All right, so this is where we are, and we see that we are progressing quite nicely. So this is our syllabus, and these are the topics, and we are today starting signals and emissions. So this is where we are. So we're doing quite well. Okay, just a reminder, as always, never too early to begin taking practice exams. These practice exams actually use the same question pool that you'll get in the real exam. So if you want to know if you're ready, gain some confidence, you can take these practice exams at any time. Highly encouraged, take as many as you wish. And if you find you're passing all, then you're ready to do the exams, right? Okay, again, well, we just have this slide in the deck. That's Zello. We have talked about that ad nauseum. And of course, all participants in this class need to be familiar with these two links here, because this is where you will get all of the material, all of the slides, the handouts that we will provide as part of the course. There's the link there, gdocs.ttreact.com. That's where you'll get all of the documents. And if you have missed any of these sessions, you can, or you would like to review any of the previous sessions, this link at the bottom here, gvids.ttreact.com, will contain a playlist of all of the recorded sessions that we have for this course. So please do make use of it. And just by the way, yes, you are feel free to share. If anyone else is interested, you can in fact share all of this material freely without a problem. So feel free. Okay. Again, just a reminder, we are using the No Nonsense General Class License Study Guide, the current version for exams between 2023 and 2027. So if you're buying the book, make sure you get the latest version, because these question pools expires every 4 years or so. So this is the current version. And of course, there are several other very good texts that you can avail yourselves of. So feel free to purchase at your discretion. Right, so we have a couple of questions from the last session, and we kind of ran out of time because we ran a bit late and we weren't able to get to these two questions. So let's deal with them first up. So I think it was Wayne who asked the question, would it be practical to have an amp or amplifier after the filter to compensate for the loss in signal? So what Wayne is really asking there, we talked about filters and filter circuits introducing loss or insertion loss once you put a filter in circuit. So that's not very desirable because you want your maximum signal to go to the antenna, for example, or to the receiver. So if you put a filter in circuit, then it's going to filter, yes, it's going to cut off, it's going to allow whatever part or frequency you wish, but it is also going to attenuate the concept of insertion loss. So Wayne is asking, well, what about if you put an amplifier after the filter to boost back up the signal? That's an excellent idea. It's an excellent question. So our answer is, well, like so many things in life, it depends. So it is possible so to do, and it's actually a pretty good idea. But whether or not it makes sense or whether it's practical so to do depends on many things. So for example, if you introduce an amplifier, just remember amplifiers can also introduce noise into a system or distortion. That is possible depending on the type of push-pull or the class A or class C or, that we discussed. So an amplifier is not without introducing its own issues as well. So that is an example of a design that you have to look at as to whether it is applicable to your use case. So short answer, yes, it's possible to. Whether or not it will be optimal will depend a lot on the circumstances. So excellent question there, Wayne. And the next question we have, I think David asked this question is, are there applications for both low and high pass filters together in parallel or series circuits? What are the outcomes? So the short answer to that, yes, certainly. We certainly did not show every single combination of filter circuits, but filter circuits are used quite a lot in especially radio frequency, radio transceivers and broadcast equipment, all sorts of, once it's radio, you're talking about filters are typically used at various stages, right? So yes, they are combined in series and in parallel, and we say that both, low pass filters and high pass filters are used in combination. So when we do so in parallel, they're called band pass filters. And when we use them in series, they tend to be either called band stop or notch filters. So the simple answer to your question there, David, is yes, certainly. So what combination, what values, which comes first, the chicken or the egg, depending on your application, your design requirements will determine how you put those filters together. But excellent question. And the short answer is yes, can and do. All right, so let's get straight into our technical topics for this evening. Modulation. So as a radio operator, ham radio operator, you will hear hams talking quite a lot about their modulation. How is my modulation? Right? But what is modulation? Well, in a way, it refers to us speaking into a microphone and then that signal being imposed or superimposed onto a radio frequency carrier. Right. So essentially, that is what it means, right? So if you were to look on the diagram here, we have different types of modulation. So we said there's a radio frequency carrier. So it's a sine wave, of probably a high frequency or VHF, UHF, whatever. There's a carrier signal. Our transmitter will generate that and transmit it out and amplify it out to the antenna via the feed line. But that's just a signal. That's just a carrier signal. There's no information. There's no real intelligence there other than the presence of a signal. So we will speak. We may use voice, or we could use a digital mode and use a computer connected to the radio. And then we'll have what we call a modulating signal. So we are now going to modulate the carrier. And then what we end up with is a modulated signal. So we start off at the top here with the carrier. This is the carrier frequency here, as we can see. And this is maybe our voice or maybe a digital signal that we apply. So it's a modulating signal. And then when we combine these two together, we get this here, which is the modulated signal. So if you look carefully, you will see that it's certainly at the frequency of the carrier. If you watch carefully, it's at that frequency, the spaces between the peaks and the trough. But notice when we apply or we impose this modulating signal, it starts to take on the shape of the modulating signal while still maintaining the frequency. And this is a particular type of modulation, right? Which we'll come to in a little bit. So you have the carrier, we modulate the carrier, and then we end up with a modulated signals. And there are different types of modulation. As ham radio operators, as amateur radio operators, we need to be quite familiar with the various types of modulations that we have access to and modes of operation, right? So that's one of the things you need to be able to select, because quite frankly, the different types of modulation or modes are usually not compatible with one another. It's kind of like one person is speaking Spanish and the other person is speaking French. Yes, they are both speaking, but if they don't know each other's language, or they don't switch the language processor, to the other language, they will not understand each other. So let's look at, there are different types of modulation that we will need to be considering at this level in the course. We have the three of them up on your screen. First one is AM. So should be familiar with that. You may have heard of AM radio. If you have a vehicle, there may still be the AM band or radio in the house or portable stereo, anything like that. You'll see AM, the AM band, right? But the AM means that the modulation is amplitude modulation, meaning the radio tower, generator, carrier, and the broadcaster, the music will apply a modulating signal, and then you have the modulated signal that goes out through the radio frequency broadcast. So that's amplitude modulation. So radio stations certainly do. There are other forms of AM, as we will see. Aircraft, for example, communication use to the tower and so on will use AM as the modulation of choice. But there's also FM, frequency modulation. So again, we should be familiar with that. You listen to the dial in the radio, you might tune to and try to go 95.1 FM, right? So that's frequency modulation, right? So you have the frequency that you dial in, but you also have the modulation type, and you need to know the modulation type, especially as an amateur radio operator, where you'll be selecting the different modes. So someone will say, hey, meet me on this frequency, but you also need, okay, on this frequency, but what mode or what modulation that you would like to use, because I need to switch to that mode as well, or that modulation to hear you, and vice versa to transmit. So frequency modulation is quite often used in amateur radio. And then there's another one, phase modulation, or PM. There was a meme that went around recently there, person saying, AM versus PM, and, people had a laugh. But there's actually a modulation type called PM, which is phase modulation, right? So we actually have up on your screen the three modulation types. We'll go a little bit into detail into some of them, but this is to compare and contrast. So notice you have the carrier, which is common to all of these. You have carrier, carrier, carrier. So there's that carrier, the oscillator generator, the amplifier will amplify it and goes out to your antenna. But then you have the modulating signal. Notice all of them, there's a modulating signal. Maybe it's a voice signal. But notice what is different. The modulated signal, when you apply your voice to the carrier, because you're using a different type of modulation, the circuitry will modulate it differently. The frequency output looks different. So notice this one is varying in amplitude. Notice that. And that's why it's called amplitude modulation. We'll come to a slide that details it out a little more. But let's compare and contrast to frequency modulation. Notice that the heights of the waves are the same, but notice the spacing in between is varying. And that's frequency. Remember, frequency here, you notice that it's expanded, it's compressed here. So what is varying in a frequency modulated signal is just that, the frequency. So it's a modulating signal, but compare and contrast to the amplitude modulation, where it's varying the height of the signal. In frequency modulation, it is varying the space. So the frequency is shifting up and down one way or the other based on the modulating signal. And then there's phase modulation. And there are different types of phase modulation as well. But phase modulation, you have the carrier, you have the modulating signal, such as your voice. When you apply it, notice what's happening to this wave. It is changing the phase, right? So amplitude modulated signal, frequency modulated signal, and phase modulated signal, giving you amplitude modulation, frequency modulation, and phase modulation. All right, so let's take a little deeper dive into amplitude modulation. So we did say you have a carrier, and then you have some sort of voice or data signal going in to modulate that carrier, and then you end up with a modulated signal. So we are expanding that a little bit on the diagram here. So we have repeated the amplitude modulated graphic from the previous slide, but we have expanded it out a little bit and show a little bit of, the inner workings in a block diagram format. And the way to show hopefully will help. If this wasn't clear, hopefully this will make it a little clearer. Now we do have a definition here, part of which will be on your exam as well. But let's talk about the diagram a little bit. So what are we trying to achieve? We are trying to speak into a microphone and get our signal out via an antenna so that we could speak around the world to another amateur radio operator. How do we do that? We use a transceiver, we use a transmitter, ham radio, amateur radio. So what we do is that radio will generate a carrier signal. That's why it has a transmitter stage or a transmitter section, right? So it will generate that, what we call a radio wave, and it will be unmodulated. So it'll be a nice sine wave like this typically. And then now we introduce a signal. It could be voice. It could also be a computer connected and sending a digital signal of tones to the microphone or to the jack, the input jack, right? And we call that the message signal. And then now this circuitry here will take the sine wave that's generated as the carrier signal, impose our voice or maybe digital signal onto it and produce a modulated signal. And for AM, this is what it will look like, because the amplitude, and amplitude meaning the height of the wave, varies. So that's why we call it amplitude modulation as opposed to phase modulation or frequency modulation, right? So this is the bit of information that you will need to know for the exam. Amplitude modulation is a very basic type of modulation, and specifically the amplitude, which is the vertical height, and instantaneous power level, that's the power level, of the radio frequency carrier signal, that's this, are varied. So we are varying it in proportion to the amplitude or loudness of the audio signal. So that's why it jumps up and down as the speech is applied. If there's no speech, this will be a nice, smooth sine wave like this. But once you apply the speech, notice the wave starts to move up and down like this. It's varying according to the applied audio. So again, this you need to be aware of for your exam. All right. So another concept is the concept of modulation envelope, right? So let's discuss what that is. So again, another representation of, we have a carrier signal. Notice it's a nice sine wave, and then we have a modulating signal. Happens to be a sine wave as well. And notice when we use the circuitry to apply the modulated signal or modulating signal to the carrier wave, we end up with AM, right? Because we are using AM circuitry to generate this. But we need to be aware that this outer envelope that is traced when we trace all of the peaks of the signal, this is called the modulation envelope, right? So that's a definition we need to learn. The modulation envelope of an AM or amplitude modulated signal is the smooth curve that connects the peak values. So these are the peak values here of the modulated signal. So this is the modulated signal here. So remember, we have the modulating signal, we have the carrier wave, and then we add them up, or we superimpose one on the other, and then we end up with this modulated signal, and gives the overall waveform. So that's the overall waveform. So this is the modulation envelope for an AM signal, and this is an exam question. Now, when we demodulate an AM signal, what we get is a waveform that looks like the modulation envelope. So what that means in a receiver, when we grab the signal from space, or from the sky, or rather from the air, and our antenna receives it and we process it, that waveform that we get when we demodulate it looks like the modulation envelope. Because if you look at it carefully, you'll notice that the modulation envelope is very similar to the modulating signal, right? So exam question, modulation envelope. All right, so we're doing pretty good on time. So let's do a couple more slides before we take our usual halfway break. So single sideband or SSB, and we did cover this a bit in the technician class. We talked about it already a bit also in the general class level, but let's do a little deeper dive into single sideband. Now, SSB or single sideband is a form of amplitude modulation. What we do is we have the amplitude modulated signal, which consists of a lower sideband, a carrier frequency, and an upper sideband. So for every AM signal, you have that lower part, upper part, and the center. All we do for single sideband is we retain one of the sidebands and get rid of, or we filter out the rest. So if we want to do lower sideband, we get rid of or chop off the USB and we chop off the carrier frequency or the carrier signal. So we are left with the lower sideband. And how we do that is typically through filters, right? So if we wanted to remain with the USB, Well, we chop off or get rid of, erase, filter out the lower sideband and the carrier frequency. These are unnecessary. One sideband alone will allow you to carry enough intelligence to make out the transmission. Now, you can have double sideband, you can have both sidebands plus the carrier, and you'll be able to hear transmission. But you could easily get rid of the lower sideband and the carrier and then receive that signal, demodulate it, and you'll get about the same intelligence. It'll sound a little bit different, but it will be the same intelligence or the same information that you'll get. If you notice one thing about the lower sideband and upper sideband, notice one is a mirror of the other. So if you got rid of one, then you have all the intelligence and you don't even need the carrier frequency anymore, because it's the carrier frequencies are what you transmit with the modulating signal and it gets to the receiver. But after that, you can get rid of it. You are just interested in the signal the person sent you. You are not really interested in the carrier frequency. That's just a means to an end. What you're interested in is the intelligence, the voice, or whatever the person would have been trying to send you. So you chop all the rest of it off and you end up with a single sideband, like here, for instance, right? We got rid of the lower sideband, we got rid of the carrier, and we remain with the upper sideband part, or USB. So single sideband is a type of amplitude modulation. Yes, it is. Right? We have just gotten rid of pieces of it. And then an AM signal has three components, as we illustrate up here. It has the carrier, which is the center frequency. And then we have the lower sideband, which are all these frequencies below it. And all the frequencies above it is called the upper sideband. So three sections to an AM signal. And of course, this here has a bandwidth, right? It's finite. It's not supposed to occupy any amount. It's specific to what is allowed for the particular mode or the modulation, right? So we also need to be aware that the carrier signal actually carries no information, right? Yeah, it's just the carrier signal to get there. It's just like the bus that gets you there. But what you're interested in is the load. So both sidebands actually carry the same information. That's what we just said. One is a sort of mirror of the other. So you don't actually need all of them. You can get rid of the carrier, you can get rid of one of the sideband, and you will have the information that you need, which is the point of the last bullet here. If you eliminate the carrier and one of the sidebands, so you get rid of a carrier and maybe the lower sideband, you can still transfer the same amount of information, which is what we have done here. We got rid of the carrier, it doesn't exist. We got rid of the lower sideband and we end up with only the upper sideband. And we have all of the information that we need. Very efficient form of mode in amateur radio in particular. All right. So continuing with single sideband, let's compare and contrast SSB over some of the other modes that we have access to. So we would have talked about Morse code or CW. We'd have talked about single sideband, double sideband, AM, and we have talked about FM. So let's compare and contrast single sideband to all of these modes. And on the right-hand side, we have a nice little graphic that shows visually. And how I like to think of these things similar to lanes on a highway. So Morse code, let's say, occupies one lane, right, in a highway. Single sideband, maybe 2 lanes or something like that. AM, maybe 6 lanes, and maybe FM, maybe 20 lanes, in a highway. It's really how much bandwidth it's occupying, right? So that's just a reference. We have a wide vehicle, it's a car. We have a wider vehicle, maybe a truck, maybe something else, an airplane, and all of that, right? So they're all occupying their bandwidth on the road. So this is the same way, in a sense, the frequency occupy bandwidth on air, or signals in the radio frequency spectrum, right? And some occupy more space than others. So very efficient mode, Morse code, right? Dits and das occupy very little space and you can communicate with that. And then we have single sideband, which occupies a bit more space. Then we have AM. Remember, we said that single sideband is a form of AM, except we truncate or chop off the upper sideband or lower sideband, as the case may be, and the carrier. So AM has all of it, and SSB is just part of it. And then frequency modulation, of course, you have a bit of a range, but it's usually occupying a lot more bandwidth. So a couple of bullet points is that one of the advantages of SSB, or single sideband voice communication, is that it has a narrower bandwidth than AM, FM, or phase modulation, right? Or PM. So this will be one of the exam questions, will be based on this. Single sideband has one of the narrowest bandwidths out there, or the modes, right? So you need to know that. Look at it visually. Of course, you can't beat CW, you can't beat Morse code, right? But the other modes, the other voice modes, for example, it is the narrower of all of these here. So we say it has a narrower bandwidth than AM, FM, and even PM, or phase modulation. So a single sideband signal, that's SSB, it takes up only 3 kilohertz, right? So look at it here, 3000 hertz, 3 kilohertz, which is the narrowest bandwidth of the phone modes. And remember, in amateur radio, anytime we talk about phone, we mean voice, meaning speech, somebody speaking. So anytime about phone modes, don't get too tied up as to what do they mean by phone. It just means you're using your voice, you're speaking, it's speech based, as opposed to a digital mode, which is a computer is doing the talking for you. All right. And just we have some other bits of information here that's useful. It says that an AM signal requires a bandwidth of 6 kilohertz or more. Right. So notice the SSB signal takes about 3 kilohertz. The AM signal takes much more than that, at least 6 kilohertz or more. And then we see an FM signal can require up to 15,000 hertz or 15 kilohertz. Right. So very efficient, these modes here. Use more space, but of course the fidelity improves as you go up, right? You get something for something, right? So when you give up bandwidth, you also have a compromise in a way, right? So fidelity is what you're giving up here, as well as the amount of information that you can transfer with some clarity and redundancy and all of that. So let's probably do one more slide before we take our break. All right. So we've been talking about modulation, but in life, you know, too much of a good thing is good for nothing. So you can over modulate. So modulation, that's what you want to do. You want to be loud and clear. You want your voice to be superimposed on that carrier with sufficient punch that when people are listening to your transmission, they don't have to go up too close, turn up the volume, ask you to repeat because you're speaking so softly. You want to modulate that carrier sufficiently, maybe 90 something percent or close to 100, you know, as much as possible, but you don't want to go over. You don't want to go at 100 plus, because that will now constitute over modulating, and then you'll start to sound distorted. You'll sound horrible. So as hams, we need to be aware of the quality of our signal, the quality of our voice. So we want to know about over modulation so we can avoid it, right? All right. And also we need to know what the term is, because when we hear another amateur radio operator on air, when they're over modulating, we need to be able to tell them that. Not just, hey, you're sounding terrible, man. You have to say, it sounds as though you're over modulating, right? Some people say you're over deviating. Some people say you're flat topping. They have different terms to describe what you're sounding like, right? So over modulation is something that we need to be aware of for our exam as well. And on your screen, we have an example of, you know, you have a signal where there's no modulation, you have a signal that's 50% modulated, a signal that's 100% modulated, and a signal that's 200% modulated. And when you do that, you will occupy frequencies that may actually be illegal too, because you're only permitted to occupy a certain amount of space in some bands. And you may, if you're at the edge of the band, you may actually really be operating illegally because your signal splashes across or splatters across or imposes itself beyond the edge of the band that you are licensed to use. So that's why you also need to be aware. You and I, we need to be very conscious of this. We don't want to over-modulate and next thing we over-deviate and go into another band that we don't have a license for, right? So also we have shown here on your screen what flat topping is. So you over-modulate and then it clips. So that part of your voice will clip and you will sound horrible. You'll sound terrible. You will not be as clear. You will not be, the fidelity will be very low. And, you know, it really is irritating when you hear someone that's over modulating. You know, you have to ask them to repeat. They're sounding loud, yes, but they were distorted, you know. So as amateur radio operators, we have to be careful when setting the audio level that's used to modulate an AM or SSB phone signal, right, or voice signal. Just be careful of that setting, microphone gain setting on your radio. If you put it too high, speak too loudly, or speak too close to it, and unless there's some kind of level controller, automatic level controller for your voice, you may over modulate and sound horrible. If the level is driven too high, and these are some of the terms that we use, you know, the level is driven too high. Yeah, you drive that voice level too high, the signal will be over modulated, and this can cause the signal to be distorted due to flat topping. And you can see here flat topping, right? You should have a properly adjusted signal, nice like this, nice and smooth like this, but no, you're over modulating and therefore you're flat topping. It's cresting and it's clipping and yes. So this is to be avoided and we need to be aware of it. We need to avoid it ourselves, and we need to assist our fellow amateur radio operators to improve their signals as well by advising them and say, hey, you're flat topping, so that they can know about it and they can make an adjustment. So one effect of overmodulating or overmodulation is that the signal can also take up excessive bandwidth beyond what is permitted. So remember we said that if you overmodulate, you may occupy a wider bandwidth than is normally permissible for the mode that you're in. And then too, if you are close to the edge of the band, you may actually go over, and that's illegal, right? So you will be committing an offense. So you want to be very careful of not being careful. Apart from sounding terrible, you may be breaking the law as well, right? So we don't want any student in this class to do that at all. You're being trained, you are being educated, you are learning. We expect everyone in this class to demonstrate good amateur radio operating practices. So you are aware of these techniques, you're aware of what you can do to avoid overmodulating. You don't shout into the microphone, you don't adjust the microphone gain too high. And there are instruments that you can monitor your modulation as well, or you could just ask someone, how am I sounding? And they have different gauges and that can help you, scopes that you can see visually what your modulation looks like as well, right? So we just need to be aware of these concepts. So folks, I think now is a good time to take a short 2-minute break, and we will come back and cover the rest of the topics for this evening. So let's get up, take a little stretch, maybe have a bathroom break, have some water, and we'll come back in 2 minutes time. All right. Yes, good evening to you, Adish. Always great to have you. Thanks for the greetings. All right, so Clint, no problem. We know how it goes. A lot of challenges, right? Life happens, right? So that's okay. So yes, so Clint, all of the recordings for the sessions are available at this link here. So if you were to go to gvids.ttreact.com, you'll see a playlist, and you can get whichever session that you might have missed. You can select it, right? So I'll just leave this slide up for a moment so you can take it down. And this is where all of the videos from session 1, I think today we are session 9. So all 8 sessions thus far are available there. And also any of the material, the slides as well, are available at this first link, gdocs.teachreact.com. All of these slides are there. We usually put it up within a couple of days after the session. We try to do it at least by the next day, right? Oftentimes we do, sometimes it's a challenge, but it's usually updated pretty quickly after the session. So have a look at these links there, Clint, and just let us know if you have any challenges. Good question indeed, and thank you for it. All right, so let's continue where we left off. Okay, so we said, one of the hallmarks of good amateur radio operation is to be sounding good, loud and clear, right? Not soft or distorted or anything other than a really good quality signal. That's what we should aim for. Sometimes there are challenges, and that's why we need to be aware of what can happen, what can go wrong, or what can we do about it? What can we do to mitigate? What tips and techniques do we have as tools in our toolkit to be able to sound better and to again assist our fellow hams as well? Because as you say, it makes no sense communicating with yourself, right? The whole idea is to communicate with others, and it's a two-way street, and we need everyone to be operating optimally as well. So that's why we always try to lend a helping hand by giving signal reports and maybe making suggestions as well as to what someone could do to help each other out. Okay. All right. So let's go now to another type of modulation. So we dealt with amplitude modulation, AM. So we're now coming to FM, or frequency modulation. So again, if you're listening to the FM band on your radio, so that FM means frequency modulation. So you'd already be familiar with FM, right? Fidelity is pretty good. It sounds really good as well, FM frequency modulation, right? But in amateur radio, FM is also used quite a lot, especially on the 2 meter and the 70 centimeter band. FM is used in VHF and UHF, those frequencies, right? Quite often. I mean, there are other modes that are used as well, but it's very popular to use analog FM on amateur radio. So repeaters, for example, or simplex operation, FM is very popular. Right. It's not really typically used on HF because of the bandwidth that it may occupy and so on, right? But certainly on those frequencies where you have more bandwidth available, FM is a very useful mode to use. So we did show a graphic before, this one on the bottom right here. You have your carrier signal, and then you have your modulating signal, and you notice the frequency shifts as we go, right? The amplitude remains the same, but the frequency is what is shifting, and that's why it's frequency modulation. So we have expanded this again, similar to the diagram for AM, where we've shown that you have your radio that will generate a carrier wave. And then we will speak, or maybe we'll use a computer to connect to the radio or the transceiver and generate a tone or signal. Or we speak into the microphone, and then now the radio will apply or superimpose or modulate using our voice onto the carrier signal, and then we end up with a signal output. And this one, because we're using the type of mode called frequency modulation, the signal is frequency modulated. So notice how frequency is higher here, the frequency is a little lower. Frequency becomes a little higher, a little lower, a little higher, a little lower, right, as we go. The amplitude remains the same, unlike an AM signal. Remember, in the AM signal, you had this envelope, right, where it's going up and down. But in frequency modulation, it's kind of shifting side to side, right, sashaying, as they say. So FM, frequency modulation, and we need to be aware for the exam, with an FM signal, the carrier's instantaneous frequency changes, right? So notice they have one frequency here, and then it goes to another frequency, and so on, proportionally to the instantaneous amplitude of the modulating signal, right, or the information that's contained. This modulating signal, when we speak here, that's the information, and it varies, the frequency varies directly proportionally to the modulating signal, which is our voice, right? So this is FM, or frequency modulation. So let's come now to another type of modulation, of which there are several subtypes, but we'll deal with phase modulation, or PM. Yes, believe it or not. So this may not have been something, depending, that you would have come across. There are quite a few people that I said there was a meme recently about that, There is PM, phase modulation. So instead of varying by amplitude instead of varying by frequency, what you do, you vary the carrier signal by the phase. You adjust the phase, right? So let's look at it. We saw this before. You have the carrier, you have the modulating signal again, our voice. When we superimpose it onto the carrier via the circuitry, we modulate the phase. So you have one phase, the phase shifts, and go again, it shifts, and so on. Notice the amplitude remains about the same generally speaking, and we notice that the frequency remains about the same generally speaking. But this is phase modulation because we are modulating the phase. We're in one phase, we switch the phase. We're in another phase, we switch the phase, and so on. And that's what carries the intelligence. So PM, or phase modulation, is another way to produce a frequency modulated signal. To produce a PM signal, the modulator changes the phase angle of the signal to convey information. So what is being changed here is the phase angle of the sine wave. The modulator used to produce a PM signal is called a reactance modulator. Nothing to do with the organization react. It's a reactance modulator. So anytime you hear phase modulation, you should be thinking reactance modulator, right? It could be used also for other modes, but for the purpose of our exam, PM reactance modulator. And the changes, how it works is changes in reactance causes a phase shift in the output signal, right? So this is an exam question you need to be aware of. PM. So we had AM, FM, and PM. All right, so let's get to some fancy modes here. So we are going to now talk about FSK, frequency shift keying. So we are modulating, we are sending a signal, but we are doing so by changing the frequency in a mode called FSK. And there's a particular type of mode that we use and we employ FSK called RTTY, radio teletype, right? So let's look at it. So some modes, such as RTTY, and that's how RTTY is pronounced. You could say RTTY, or people say RTTY, but it stands for radio teletype, uses a modulation method called frequency shift keying, or abbreviated FSK. Now, RTTY is a digital signal, right? So again, we're now getting into the realm of digital modes or digital signals, consisting of marks and spaces, right? So those are the two values. It's either a mark or a space. So some people say it's a 1 or a 0, but it's once you take digitals ones and zeros typically, right? So that's what digital means. Computer operates on 1 and 0 binary. So we may say it's a mark and a space, or 1 and a 0, right? Now a mark is sent at one frequency and the space is sent at another frequency. So that is how you can determine what is a mark and a space. So notice here, you have the carrier, then you have the modulating signal. So this is digital. So you have a 1 and a 0, maybe a 1 and a 0, maybe, right? Let's just say. But we recognize that these signals are at different levels. So when we apply this modulating signal, notice it's not a nice smooth sine wave, right? It's a square wave like this, right? So you have the mark and the space, mark and the space. And we apply it to the carrier. Notice what happens here. We are frequency modulating, right? So this is one frequency, and from here to here is another frequency. From here to here is one frequency, and here's another frequency, right? So we are repeating this frequency here, 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 and here. And we're repeating this frequency here, 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 and here. So those are the two frequencies that are being used, right? So we're alternating between one and the other. So this frequency, then it switches to this frequency, in sync with the modulating signal, which is a digital signal, ones and zeros, right? So a mark is sent at one frequency and the space is at another. The RTTY signal therefore alternates between one and the other. So RTTY. And for the exam, you need to know that a direct binary FSK modulation, so again, they're trying to tie us up with some fancy terminology, but don't get tied up. They say direct binary, so direct binary, right? So it's a direct signal and it's binary, 1 and 0. FSK means frequency shift keying. Modulation is generated by changing an oscillator's frequency directly with a digital control signal. So what that means is this is our digital control signal. And in the circuitry that generates the carrier as well as applies the modulating signal, what is happening here is that it takes the modulating signal to the oscillator, and that is what shifts the frequency between this frequency and the other frequency. So that is how it actually operates, and this is in fact an exam question. So be aware, be familiar with this concept. You use a direct digital control signal to change or modulate the frequency in an FSK transmission. Right, so as you probably guess, we could talk about FSK. So we come to phase shift keying, or PSK. So remember, we are doing some themes here, right? We talked about AM, we talked about FM, we talked about PM, right? So we just talked about FSK. Now we're talking about PSK, right? And the P in the PSK is phase shift keying. So shift keying meaning that we are modulating. We're trying to again use a digital signal, and we're trying to send that intelligence across the radio waves. And we're doing it by keying or applying a signal onto the carrier wave to send it out, right? So in one case, just now we use frequency shift keying. Now we are going to another mode type called PSK, phase shift keying. And we talked about what phase is, right? We said it's one direction, then the other. All right, so phase shift keying is another way to send digital whereby the phase of the modulation is changed, not the frequency, right? So again, look at it here. Notice the frequency is steady right through, but what we're doing is one phase, it changes phase, bam, shifts, changes phase again, bam, in sync or in accordance with the digital signal. So every time you go from a mark to a space, notice the frequency changes here by phase, not the actual frequency itself. The phase is what is changing each time to show that switch alternating between one signal level and the other. And we need to know that binary phase shift key, and anytime you have binary 1 and 0, it's two different distinct values. It shifts the phase 180 degrees to send one bit at a time. So that's how binary or BPSK operates. Now, BPSK is fine. You can send one bit at a time. But there's another type of phase shift keying, and we need to know this also for exam, called QPSK, and the Q is there for quadrature. So quadrature phase shift keying. So you see how the knowledge is kind of building. We talked about phase modulation, then we came to phase shift keying, and now we're talking about quadrature phase shift keying. So that's why it's important for us to understand the foundational concepts, because one thing is building on the next. So we need to take the time, make sure that at least we follow at a basic level what the base concept is, and then we apply now and we change it up a little bit. But it wouldn't tie us up because we understand the base concept. It's a 1 and a 0. What are we doing with this 1 and a 0? Okay, we are representing a signal. And then we build an knowledge and say, oh, okay, we could do that and make it a little more complex and, engineer it a little bit to get more out of it. So this QPSK allows more phase shift operation options and sends two, right? So or a pair bits at a time. So 2 bits at a time. So remember, with BPSK, you can only send 1 bit at a time. And QPSK can send 2 bits at a time, or a pair of bits. And we have that little diagram showing you here. So this is BPSK. We are saying that we are only sending 1 bit per symbol. So 1 bit, 1, 0, 1, 0, 0. So it's only 1 bit at a time because we are using binary phase shift key, BPSK. But if we were to use QPSK, which is quadrature phase shift keying, we can send 2 bits per symbol. So a 1, 0, we're sending a 1, 1, a 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, and so on, right? We are sending 2 bits per signal, right? And that's the point, is bullet point here, it's exam question. But we also need to be aware for the exam that whereas a BPSK, or binary phase shift keying, either could be plus or minus 180 degrees, a QPSK signal can shift 0, 90, 180, and 270 degrees. And that allows sending of data faster. But note that it takes a slightly higher bandwidth as well, right? So that's just some extra information for you. So we also have a little phasor diagram here that shows it, BPSK, right, 180 degrees, whereas QPSK, notice they have 0, 90, 180, 270. You have different ways you can represent it on this phasor diagram here, or the circle, but we'll go with 0, 90, 180, and 270 because that is what is in the exam, right? So this is what you need to learn for PSK, phase shift keying, specifically binary phase shift keying, BPSK, which is 1 bit at a time. Here you go, only 1 bit, 1, 0. Or QPSK, which you can send 2 bits at a time, 1 and 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, So you're sending more information using this type of modulation, QPSK, quadrature phase shift keying. All right, so now that we talked about QPSK, there's a specific mode in amateur radio that we can use sometimes. It's called QPSK 31. All right. So it's PSK, but there are a couple things that we need to know for the exam about QPSK 31. So first of all, we need to know that it is sideband sensitive. Secondly, we need to know that there's encoding that provides error correction in QPSK. And also that the bandwidth that is utilized is about the same as BPSK 31, right? So QPSK 31 uses about the same bandwidth as BPSK 31. So it makes it very efficient. So let's deal with something here that sounds probably a little bit odd, again, error correction. Well, what exactly is error correction? What it means is that in the signal itself, if an error bit is introduced, because of the error correcting code, it is able to detect it and correct it. So it does not only detect, but it corrects. So there's enough information in the signal that in a way you could say it's redundant information. It allows errors, simple errors really, to be corrected. Very complex errors, difficult to correct, but simple, bit swap or missing bit or something, it can correct. So we need to be aware of these 3 points. You'll get an exam question about QPSK and all 3 will be correct. It is sideband sensitive, it provides error correction, and the bandwidth that it uses is approximately the same as B or binary PSK 31. So this is QPSK, quadrature phase shift keying 31. All right. So let's now talk about a digital mode that is very popular. So it used to be fairly new a couple of years ago. Now people say, well, FT8 has been around for quite some time, that some people don't call it new anymore, right? But FT8 is one of the most popular digital modes. So we just talked about some digital modes, QPSK 31, PSK, RITI, all of those are digital modes. Remember what we said a digital mode is, right? We said it in the technician class. We kind of mentioned it already in the general class, but we'll re-emphasize again. A digital mode, anytime you hear digital mode, it means that you're connecting a computer or some sort of computing device. Sometimes a radio has that computer built in. Sometimes it's an external laptop, tablet, computer, or desktop that you're connecting, or maybe a Raspberry Pi or something of a compute nature that you're connecting to your radio. In other words, you're not using your voice. So remember we said in amateur radio, when we say phone mode, we are using our voice. We are speaking, we are speechifying, we are talking. But with digital modes, we are connecting a computer to the radio and let the radio do the talking, right? So FT8 is one of those modes, and we'll show a little screenshot just now that'll give you an idea of what the software looks like, just so that you're aware, and a little map as well to show some communication that took place via FT8. But FT8 is one of the most popular narrowband digital modes, right? So bear that in mind. One of the software that could be used, you can install on your computer to do FT8 is called WSJTX. It's a popular software to use FT8 to send and receive FT8 signals, right? And there's some seriously cool algorithms built into that software that allows you to receive very low strength signals, or what we call weak signals. I mean, you could barely hear anything inside of there, and you'll see your computer decoding signals. And you say, wait a minute, all I'm hearing is noise. Yes, that's one of the things we say about FT8. And other modes like GT65, FT4, they are weak signal propagation modes, right? Meaning that they can be, the signal is well into the noise floor, but you can decode it still, weak signal propagation modes. So we say that it allows it to receive very weak signals with low signal to noise ratios. Also, we need to be aware that the modulation type that is used for FT8, that mode FT8, is an 8-tone frequency shift keying, or FSK. So you see how the knowledge builds? Once you understand the base knowledge, when we say that FT8 uses an 8-tone FSK signal, you're like, oh yeah, cool, I know what FSK is. It's frequency shift keying, right? I know what frequency modulation is, and it's frequency shift keying. 8-tone, okay, right, so there are 8 tones, right? So hence FT8, right? And just a bit of extra information, sometimes a visual is cool. There are persons who may be aware of frame types and so on. So we have the frame type here for an FSK signal, specifically FT8. This is what it looks like, that you can take a look at your own time and just for your own general edification. So this defines what an FT8 frame looks like. All right, so did promise you a little bit of a screenshot. So on the right hand side here is what the FT8 software looks like. You have different amateur radio signals. One is communicating, someone is calling CQ, CQ, another person is replying, and so on. And you actually have communications going here, right? So this screenshot was taken a couple of years ago, maybe yeah, let's see, 2021 actually, 10th of June. Yeah, there you go. So a couple of years ago. And these are actual transmissions live on the air. And this is the FT8 software called WSGTX, right? So WSGTX can do other modes besides FT8, by the way, but it's one of the most popular. You have MSHV and other things that other software that can use to do FT8. And this just shows a map of the world. PSK Reporter is the name of the website, if you can take a look at it if you wish. And this shows all of the places that heard the signal. So this actually is a screenshot that I would have taken to show where around the world different amateur radio operators were hearing my signal from Trinidad and Tobago at this time of the day. Right, so it was at 01:53 hours. So this is UTC, right? So this was sometime in the night, June 10th, right? And a lot of information here. The frequency that was in use, 18.100, FT8 mode, 17 meters, and so on. Right, so this just gives an idea that you can communicate with a computer without saying a word all around the globe using this software called WSGTX and a mode called FT8. Very popular, and as you become licensed as an amateur radio operator, you may want to check that mode out on HF. When you get your radio, you get your computer connected up, and you can have lots of fun and see how far 100 watts can take you. You'll be surprised with the propagation on HF via the ionosphere, how far your signal can go. Right, so look at this, pretty good, pretty cool. And this is at a particular time of the day, particular time of the year, and a particular point in the sunspot cycle, right? Using a particular antenna, particular radio, particular computer with the WSGTX software. All right. So we have a couple more concepts to complete before we go into our question pool. So let's go with them. So the first one is the concept of link margin. So anytime we're talking about signals, especially digital signals, but really any signal, you have a link that can be formed between two, whether it's two amateur radio operators or two access points. Or, you have two devices that are communicating. They may be communicating digitally, so you have a communications link. So you may want to know what is the link margin on that link. So the way I would might I suggest, let's see, an analogy to the link margin is like a taxi fare, right? Now, bear with me here. If you have to take a taxi from one place to another, there is a fare that you must be able to pay to take that taxi. So let us say that taxi fare is $20, right? If you do not have $20, you are not going to go anywhere. You need to have at least $20 to pay that $20 taxi fare. Anything above the $20 in your wallet is your link margin, right? So the link margin is the difference between what you need to get your communication going versus what you have available. So it's like a little bit of a budget in a way, right? The extra amount that you have. So that's why I'm using the taxi as an example. If you go to the taxi driver and say, I only have $15, you go nowhere. Well, unless you know the person or they're feeling very kind-hearted, you need at least $20. That's the threshold you need to cross. But let's say you have $25. Well, there you go. You have that $5, you have a $5 link margin, right? So we do that in radio as well. And we say that the link margin is the additional signal strength beyond what is minimally required for reliable communication. And that serves as your buffer, as your extra to account for uncertainties and variations in the transmission equipment. So maybe a little rain falls and you're in the microwave region and therefore your signal drops a little bit. Because you have some link margin, you have some headroom, the signal still goes through okay. But if you have no headroom at all, the signal is faded and it's gone and you have a drop transmission and all of that, right? But for your exam, you need to know this particular definition. A link margin is the difference between the received power level and the minimum required signal level at the input to the receiver. So it's saying one and the same thing. This is the formal definition that you need for the exam. And this is just a bit more of an explanatory as to what it is. So I like to think of it as a taxi fare. I need to make at least $20 to be able to go anywhere. And I have extra $5, maybe I need to go a little off route or something like that. Or, extras, you don't go exact, right? Well, We try not to go exact. I mean, if it is, it is, but try to go with a margin, link margin. So a similar concept, right, is the link budget. And the link budget is just like your financial budget, because in your financial budget, we have, or we ought to have, a concept of what our income is, what our expenditure is, and then what the remainder or savings could be, right? Well, we should, right? Otherwise, we may be living beyond our means. I don't know. So once we know our income, maybe it's $100 and our expenditure is $40, so we have $60 left over, right? And that's the concept of a linked budget. You look at all of the additions, all of the income, and all of the things that go out and what you have left over, right? So that's how I think about it, that the linked budget is similar to my financial budget. All right, so let's talk about the exam question. But before we go to that, so link budget is the comprehensive accounting of all gains and losses in a communication link, ensuring that there's enough signal strength for reliable data communication, right? So link budget. A link budget for the exam is the sum of transmit power and antenna gains minus system losses as seen as the receiver. So as seen at the receiver. So this is the formal definition for the exam, right? And just a little graphic here to show transmitter, receiver, antennas, and so on. You see the gains, you see the losses, all right? So you have a transmitter output power, and then you have attenuation or insertion loss, because the signal goes across the airwaves, reaches here, and it gets the receiver, and it needs to be at a certain signal for reliable communication. So we need to know what our link budget is. All right, so let's go to our usual question pool review that will cover all of the questions in the question pool related to all of the theory that we just covered. All right, so those who are following the No Nonsense Guide, we are on page 41. Let's go. What type of modulation varies the instantaneous power level of the RF signal? So we said that that amplitude that is varying the power level instantaneous, it's called AM or amplitude modulation. Next question in the question pool. What is the modulation envelope of an AM signal? So we did show a little sketch of what it looked like, but for the exam, it's the waveform created by connecting the peak values of the modulated signal. So you just draw the modulated signal and then you connect the peaks of them, right? And that's your modulation envelope. Next question in the question pool. Which of the following phone emissions uses the narrowest bandwidth? So we did say that, so we're talking phone emissions, right? If they didn't say phone emissions, then we might be tempted to say, hey, CW, Morse code, that mode CW occupies very little bandwidth, right? But they did say phone emissions. So if we dissect this question, phone emission means voice. So of all, remember we showed we had SSB or single sideband, we had AM and we had FM. Of all of them, single sideband is the one that occupies the narrowest space or bandwidth. All right. Right. Okay. What is meant by the term flat topping when referring to an amplitude modulated phone signal? So let's dissect this question. What are they asking us? They're asking us the meaning of a term. Which term? Flat topping. But what type of signal are we talking about? We're talking about an AM signal, amplitude modulated. But what type? Phone signal. So it's voice. So remember, we're speaking. Flat topping, of course, means that we are over modulating and therefore the signal gets distorted, right? So the answer is signal distortion caused by excessive drive or too much, you're shouting too much or using too much microphone gain or speech levels, right? So that's what can lead to flat topping, to be assiduously avoided. All right. Which of the following is an effect of over modulation? So we did say, or we did warn that if you overmodulate, then you might, deviate or deviate beyond what is normal for the mode. And if, depending on the frequency of operation, you might actually step out of bounds into another band that you are not licensed to use, right? So you could be operating illegally. But once you overmodulate for that mode, you will use more bandwidth than necessary. So the answer is excessive bandwidth. Stay in your lane. All right. What is the name of the progress? I say again, what is the name of the process that changes the instantaneous frequency of an RF wave to convey information? Let's dissect this question. What are they asking us? What is the name of the process? But for what? It changes the instantaneous frequency of what? Of a radio frequency wave to convey information, right? So we're not talking about changing the amplitude. We're not talking about changing the phase. We are talking about changing the frequency. So what kind of modulation will it be? It will be frequency modulation. Yeah. Let's continue. What is the name of the process that changes the phase angle of an RF signal to convey information? Very similar to the previous question, but let's dissect it. They're asking us what's the name of the process that what? Changes the phase angle. Now, they didn't tell us the amplitude. They didn't tell us the frequency. They say it's changing the phase of an RF signal. So that means a carrier wave to convey information. And those we are modulating it. So we are modulating it according to the phase. So what's the answer to that? Naturally, phase modulation. All right, let's continue. What emission is produced by a reactance modulator connected to a transmitter RF amplifier stage? Okay, let's dissect this question. What are they asking us? They're asking us what emission. So remember, in radio, emission is a transmission. It's a signal. It's a wave that is leaving a transceiver or transmitter going down the line of a coaxial cable or your transmission line or your feed line, as we will call it, going to the antenna and going into space, right? Going into the air. So that's the emission that they're talking about. But it's produced by, well, a transmitter RF amplifier stage, right? That is what is driving the antenna. So it's a transmitter, radio frequency transmitter coming out of the amplifier stage. But it's produced by a reactance modulator. So we did say that in our case, when we hear reactance modulator, the mode or the modulation that we are considering is phase modulation, right? So reactance modulator gives us phase modulation. Could give us other things too, right? Okay. What is, I say again, how is direct binary FSK modulation generated? Right? So remember, FSK meant frequency shift keying, right? So how is direct binary, right? The two states there, right? 1 and 0. How is it generated? Well, we showed a diagram of the signal, the carrier signal, and then we showed the actual 1s and 0s. So how it's generated is by changing an oscillator's frequency directly with a digital control signal. So the oscillator frequency is what generates the carrier wave, and then we apply the direct digital control signal, which is our 1 and 0, to it, and that is what causes the frequency shift to occur between the first frequency and the second frequency, the two frequencies. All right, so let's go to the next question in the question pool. What is QPSK modulation? So just remember, Q in this case means quadrature. So what is quadrature? Phase shift keying, right? So we said those were the four values: 0, 90, 180, 270. So that will be in the answer. So we say it's modulation in which digital data, because it's a digital mode we're talking about, is transmitted by using 0, 90, 180, 270, right? Phase shift to represent pairs of bits. So it's phase shift keying, but it's quadrature. Quadrature meaning 4, and you have 0, 90, 180, 270, which are 4 angles, right? So 4 phase angles or 4 phase shifts to represent the pair of bits, because it's QPSK. BPSK would have represented 1 pair of bit, 1 and 0, but in the case of QPSK, it represents this, right? So bear that in mind. Next question in the question pool will be, which of the following is characteristic of QPSK 31? So it's still quadrature phase shift keying, but it's QPSK 31. So we did show a list of properties of QPSK 31, and we did say the exam question will say all are correct, right? So first of all, it's sideband sensitive. It also provides error correction, and also the bandwidth is approximately that of BPSK 31. So therefore, all of these are correct, and that's the answer. All these choices are correct. All right, a couple more questions. We'll bring it to a close. So folks, what type of modulation is used by FT8? So FT8, it's an 8-tone frequency shift keying. That is what FT8 mode is. Right, so last two questions, folks. What is link margin, right? So we did say Link margin, that's kind of like, you have a taxi fare, right? You have the minimum that you need to achieve, and then you have then some. So the link margin is the difference between the receive power level and the minimum required signal level at the input to the receiver. So that's what link margin is. Last question in the question pool for this evening. What is a link budget? So we did say a link budget is similar to your own personal financial budget, right? It contains all of the income, all of the expenditure, and of course, what you have left over. Is the balance, the sum of transmit power and antenna gains minus system losses as seen at the receiver. So you'll end with a balance, just like your personal budget. Okay. So let's just go back to our slide deck. All right. So again, folks, this is the No Nonsense License Study Guide. We dealt with pages 41 to 45 this evening. If you have any questions, please feel free to send to this email address or WhatsApp to this number on your screen. And also, we are sending out updates for the course, such as the links, the information. We will also send the latest video as well. Once it's properly captured and saved onto YouTube, we will send it out. So feel free to subscribe to this channel. It's a bit to write down, so you can always get it from the slide deck as well, but we leave it up. If anybody wanted to take a screenshot or anyone wanted to write it down, you can do so, but we recommend get it from the slide deck. It's quite a bit of a mouthful. Maybe we could put a quick link to it for the next class, right? So feel free to join that channel if you so desire. But we do also send out updates at least once a week via email. We are still having a couple of participants who have mailbox full, right? So please, if you're one of them, double check your mailbox. We are no longer really sending any big attachments. That's one of the takeaways that we have from previous classes. We are just sending a short email with links. So all of the attachments, we will just send a small ICS file, which is if you do calendaring via things like Outlook, we'll send the calendar so you'll have a reminder in your appointment, right? But it's a very small file. Other than that, all of the other files can be found in the links that we showed for the material. So our next session, yes, folks, we are expecting to have a session next week, Friday. We know it's very close to Christmas indeed. We want to press on, so we're committed. Again, if that's not a convenient day to you, hopefully the recordings will stick and you'll be able to consume the material. So we'll do our endeavor our best. And so again, just to make progress, to make sure that we're covering the course. Remember, the volunteer examiners are probably going to hang on us a little bit, wait on us until we complete this course for them to schedule the next exam session. So we don't want to have them hanging too much. They are simply quite kind, and therefore we want to press on, right, and get the material going. All right. So next session, next Friday, 22nd of December, usual start time, 8:30 p.m., God's willing. So thank you everyone for your attendance. The questions are really good. So hopefully see you next week. So folks, do have a good night. Be safe. Take good care.